So welcome to FACT's webinar called Why Trees Die in Silvopasture and How You Can Save Them. This is part 2 of a 3-part series about silvopasture systems. Our presenter today is Steve Gabriel with Wellspring Forest Farm, and this webinar is hosted by Food Animal Concerns Trust. I am Larissa McKenna, FACT's Humane Farming Program Director, and I'm going to be moderating today's session. So welcome everyone, thanks for being here. All right, let me just take a minute or two for some quick introductions to make sure everyone's familiar with us before we dive right into Steve's presentation. So Food Animal Concerns Trust, or FACT, we are a national nonprofit organization that is headquartered in Illinois, and we promote the safe and humane production of meat, milk, and eggs. I have the honor and the privilege and the pleasure of working with farmers and ranchers all across the country. And I lead the Humane Farming Program. We provide a number of services and opportunities for farmers, livestock and poultry farmers, including grants, scholarships, a mentorship program, and of course, these webinars on a whole variety of topics. So I invite you to visit our website to learn all about our other services, including our Fund to Farmer grants, for which we are currently accepting applications. So this time I'm really pleased to introduce our esteemed presenter, Steve Gabriel. Steve is an agroforestry extension specialist for the Cornell Small Farms Program, and he's also managing editor of Small Farms Quarterly. He's written several books about silvopasture, and along with his wife Liz, Steve stewards Wellspring Forest Farm in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York. So we're really lucky to have Steve with us again this week to share his experience and his expertise on this topic. And so I think without further ado, Steve, I'm going to turn it right over to you so you can start your presentation.
Okay, you can hear me all right?
I can hear you. I'm going to go on mute now.
All right, thanks. Great. Thanks for being here, everybody. Happy to continue our conversation from last week. Maybe you were able to join us or can review the recording at another time, but we're going to I'll do a quick review of a couple key points that'll launch us into this topic. Last week, we talked about planning as a large process and different directions that planning could take us in silvopasture. And this week, we're going to kind of zoom in a bit on the trees, which is something I find a lot of folks have a lot of questions about. And I encourage you during the presentation to enter those questions in the chat, and I'm happy to answer them as we go, as many as I can get to. There's a lot of nuances to individual trees, but there's some general patterns and principles about supporting trees and understanding a bit about why trees do well or don't do well in different planting scenarios. So let me just share my screen here. Okay. I will mention from the outset here, if you're interested, our website is silvopasturebook.com. And if you go there, you can order the book directly from me, from the author, which is always great, supports the work more than if it's bought through another bookstore purveyor. But if you buy it through a bookstore, please buy it through a local independent bookstore. But on the website is also a repository of a lot of different content that you might be interested in perusing. Just a couple of things to mention. We do an online course every season. We have a live session, but it's actually an ongoing course you can access. It's meant to be a companion to the book. So each week has a section of resources in tandem with the chapters in the book, and a bunch of different guests that we've had, and we've kind of expanded upon a lot of the different content there. And each year we do a live session where we add new content from guest presenters and myself. And so over time, when you sign up for the course, you have lifetime access, and you get access to that ongoing content. So we're kind of building a library of resources and thinking through a lot of the nuances of silvopasture as we go. The other thing I'll mention is under video. There's a lot of different videos of different talks and conversations I've had over the years. And then under resources are a couple of the things I'm going to share with you during the webinar today. One of them is a new tree calculation tool, which I'll talk about at the end of the webinar. We also have a farm tour where we're building out a map of our farm. You can view that on Google Earth web version and kind of see some of the silvopasture stuff we're working on our farm. And then there's just a ton of links to a lot of different really great resources on the web that you might find interesting as you think about your silvopasture. So with that, let's just quickly mention that at the outset of last week, I talked a lot about some overarching principles. When we think about silvopasture, we're thinking about the combination and the intersection of trees and forages and livestock, and seeing ourselves as farmers and ranchers being the sort of orchestra conductors of those three elements in the system. And the big element for any livestock producer in silvopasture is the trees, and thinking about and understanding more about how the trees function in that system. Hopefully, you're coming to silvopasture with some experience managing the animals themselves, and also some experience with forage management, and hopefully utilizing rotational grazing, because we know that's best for the animals. It's also best for the grasses. It tends to be more productive per unit of land than any other system. So with that kind of foundation, then we can add the trees in. Silvopasture doesn't actually work well if rotational grazing isn't already happening, because the trees need interaction with the animals and also rest from them in the same way that the forage, grasses and legumes and forbs and other things do. So what we need to do if we're going to understand what's going on with trees and plantings of trees is thinking a bit about how trees grow, both as individuals and as communities. So we talked last week, and I won't rehash all these details, but just to kind of summarize a few of them, that there's kind of four main elements that determine anywhere in the world how a tree grows on a site. Just because a given species is on your farm or on a given piece of land doesn't mean it's going to thrive there. So the soil and microclimate can play a big role in that, as well as the individual genetics of the tree, as well as how intact the different fungal networks are that actually support the health and vitality of those different tree species. And so those are kind of the four main building blocks of what we see when we think about what trees thrive and which trees are really struggling on a landscape. So our job is to really understand the individual needs of the species we're working with, put them in the right place, and have a really good plan to help them get established and get them on their way. And at some point, we can back off of that plan as we go. I really would recommend, if you want to read up and think more, one of the things I found in my experience, my background's in forestry, so I came to farming as a forester, and that's helped a lot. But if you're more coming from the farming background and trying to get to know trees, there's a wonderful book called Trees of Power. Akiva Silver runs a nursery very close to where we are here in central New York. And it's a wonderful book, not just about some of the best trees and strategies for how to propagate and encourage them in your landscape, but really also just, I think, a paradigm and a thinking about trees and about them in the landscape that I think is really important. So I'd recommend checking that out. That's published by Chelsea Green, which is also the same publisher of the books that I've written. And so what we're going to think about, and I used to call this talk, and it's still advertised this way, as why trees die. And I just felt like, given the climate we're in this year and where we're at, especially in the U.S., I know not everyone's in the U.S., but I wanted to flip that on its head a bit and just talk about why or how we can support trees to thrive. So maybe it's just my desire for a little more positivity in the context, but it's the same kind of concept. The reasons that trees die in the landscape is because we don't pay attention to all the factors that allow them to do well. And so we end up, I was just listening to a podcast actually talking about this with climate change. There's a lot of initiatives out there to plant trees. And most of those initiatives focus on the numbers of trees planted, but not the numbers of trees that actually survive in the landscape. And they consider it a success if, X group plants 1,000 trees, but they don't go back to see, how many of those 1,000 trees actually survive. And ultimately with climate change, that's very important. And with your silvopasture, that's also really important. I mentioned last week in the webinar that out in nature, we can go up and look at this if we want pictures here. Out in nature, Mother Nature plants just tons and tons of trees. And the strategy there is to overplant and overthin. So on an acre of land, we might have 100,000 seeds that eventually turn into 100 or 200 trees in a finished canopy. And that's a very small percentage of survivability when we're bringing trees into the landscape, we're going to drastically increase the survivability rate based on the amount of support we give them. But what I do know from my experience with a lot of farms is that they get into tree planting and then they have some failure and trees do die. And then they say, well, this isn't going to work. It's not worth my time and energy and the resources I have to put in. And so I'm just not going to do this. And so what we have to do is couple our expectations being realistic, meaning that some trees will die. That's inevitable. But also increase the chances of success for all the trees. And one key thing is that we don't tend to, what we tend to do, I should say, is plant trees as individuals out in our fields by themselves. What we really need to do is plant trees as communities, and plant really densely and then thin them out. And a good example here is a black locust planting here we did on our farm. This is back in 2014. We planted these trees 1 meter or 3 feet apart. And you can see them here. And just now in 2020, I did a initial thinning, and I left some of the straightest, tallest, the standard trees to be the finished canopy. And then I coppiced and pollarded, which is a way of cutting the main stump of the tree and encouraging resprout growth. So I was thinning this, but these trees are only straight and tall and only doing as well as they are because of the density that we planted them at initially. And if we'd planted these at a 40-foot spacing or a 20-foot spacing or a 10-foot spacing, we wouldn't have the type of structure that we see from black locust when they're planted in a forest. And that's just one example in one tree species. But we see trees open grown in fields by themselves, kind of bushing out and being more round. What trees want to do is actually be planted very tightly together and be forced to grow upwards. If you're familiar with this from gardening, it's a similar thing to planting carrots, where you plant very densely and then you thin them out. So planting trees as communities, as clusters, and thinking about planting densely, I think will go a long way. What I want to talk about, though, is go back to that thriving trees and kind of look at these different aspects and answer some of your questions as we go here. So I would summarize, and we'll look at some of these pictures here. If we want trees to thrive in the landscape, and another way to say that is less trees to die in the landscape, then these are really the essential things to focus on as we go. And I see that Paige mentions that black locusts are not allowed in Minnesota. That is a common thing, unfortunately, that black locust is, I think, a very misunderstood species. It has the potential in our landscape to offer us a fast-growing, nitrogen-fixing, rot-resistant wood that could be used for fence posts, could be used for even decking. We could remove the pressure-treated wood industry if we grew more black locust. It's an incredible pollinator plant. It actually, nutritionally, from a tree fodder standpoint, for our livestock, offers basically the same nutrition as alfalfa, so very high proteins. It's a wonderful tree, very easy to grow, very tolerant of a lot of different poor sites. But yes, often illegal in places to plant, and mainly that's because of its perception as a non-native and sometimes called invasive. I would call it opportunistic species. And actually, silvopasture is a great place for trees like that, because your animals and your livestock can help keep them a bit in check if you're worried about that. But we won't go too far down that road. But yeah, that definitely shows up. It's a very interesting aspect of this whole thing. So let's first start with the healthy roots piece, because this is something that is really probably one of the more important ones. If we don't start from this place, I think we're going to have a hard time going. So healthy roots, whether you grow your own trees on your farm or you buy them in, what's really important is that when you put them out in the field, they have a really dense, fibrous root system, and that they have some combination of structural roots and what we sometimes call feeder roots, or the more fibrous roots. And different trees have different kind of combinations of these. This is a seedling of a red alder. So the alders tend to have kind of a balance of these more structural, thicker roots, as you can see, and the more fibrous feeder roots. I've gotten plenty of trees from different nurseries, I won't name names, where I see almost no feeder roots and almost just maybe one or two of these more structural roots. But if you don't have a dense root system, you're probably starting off with a tree that's going to struggle, especially if you're putting it in a more marginal soil. So often if I buy trees from a nursery and I don't feel like they're ready, I might put them in our on-farm nursery and actually grow them out for a season and then dig them out and put them in the ground out sort of in the wild, so to speak. So we want to make sure we get them off to a good start. The other thing is I'd really recommend when you're purchasing trees or growing them is that you avoid balled and burlap or containerized trees, meaning growing trees in pots, because both of those scenarios create situations where the roots tend to run up against the boundaries of those planters, and then they'll grow around the tree, and that's called root girdling. And if we get root girdling in our trees, we will have problems guaranteed. And a tree can sit there for 80 or 90 years, totally girdling itself and look like it's alive, but it'll grow as slow as a brick, if you go that way. So I actually often in hands-on workshops will demonstrate to folks, shock and awe sometimes, that it's okay to take a pair of pruners to the roots of your tree and actually prune those roots if you have roots that look like they're about to girdle or have been girdling the tree. But if we do what's called bare root planting, which means we either buy plants from a nursery or we dig them out of our nursery during the dormant time. So for deciduous trees in central New York, we're digging trees basically now. November is a great month usually, and then again in sometimes March, sometimes April in the spring. Sometimes we can, be digging well into December, and sometimes we have to really hold up. It all depends on the season. But sometime in that November, December, and April, March, April range for us here in central New York, and you can kind of adjust to wherever you are. When the trees are dormant, we're actually exposing the root systems, but it's okay because they're essentially in a holding pattern. And then we can transplant those trees very easily to new planting sites. And if we're buying them from a nursery, it's much better in most cases, to buy them in that state. And if a nursery's shipping in the middle of the summer, it's not a great time to plant trees. And usually the root systems are going to be active. And so you're really stressing out the tree as you go, right? So really healthy, dense root systems, doing some pruning potentially, and then moving them at the right time and planting them at the right time is really key. We find on our farm that the off season, the shoulder season, is really when we're focused on and thinking about planting trees. So sometimes if the spring isn't conducive and I had a shipment of trees come in, then I'm going to hold on to those in our nursery beds while I wait for better conditions, which in this case, in this summer, it was actually this fall is a wonderful time to plant trees versus the spring was too dry and hot to really get them established well. And that's fine. I think an essential part of a silvopasture farm is probably going to be infrastructure for holding trees, planting trees, propagating trees. Because if you really want to put trees on your farm, it's going to be probably much more economical for you to grow some of those in addition to buying them in over time. So that's most critical. Very important that we start with really healthy root systems. Second would be really matching the placement of our trees to the landscape itself and thinking about how this is going to interact with all the different functions so that we're not stressing out our trees, we're not running up against them with equipment or with our animals and our livestock grazing systems. So this is actually a image from one of the permaculture books by Bill Mollison back in the day. And what I want to emphasize here is these 4 A, B, C, and it looks like it got cut off, but there's this D low store site. And so what this is showing is these 4 different areas of the land. So we have the high plateaus, the high flatter areas, the upper slopes, the lower slopes, and then the lowlands or the bottomlands. And that's one kind of starting point to think about where trees like to grow. We find that trees are suited to different elevations and different types of landform. And generally speaking, they like to be in one of those areas. Some of them can handle different ones, and there's a difference between what they tolerate versus what they thrive in. But for instance, oaks, hickories, those kind of trees really like these upper slopes as their preferred. They'll grow on some of the higher plateau areas. They'll grow on some lower slopes, but really their prime is kind of on upper slopes in the landscape versus like black walnut, which really is a bottomland tree. It'll grow in the lower slopes or in the bottomlands of the site. And often, within a given species, you'll find different types of trees that will grow at different areas in the landscape. So for instance, the populus genus, we have poplars and aspens. We have aspens that grow at high elevations, high on the landscape. We have cottonwoods that grow on low elevations in lower parts of the landscape and so forth. So you on your farm might have all 4 of these different types. You also your farm might be a larger sort of microcosm of, a larger watershed. So that's kind of like a nesting dolls thing where these different landforms exist. And I'd really recommend folks to kind of think about this and pay attention, because that can really help us determine which species and where they might go on the landscape as we think about this. So for instance, our farm has all 4 of these landscape features, but we also are kind of at the top of the watershed. So we're one of those high plateaus in the bigger picture once we zoom out a bit more in the big scheme of things. Another thing with placement is always in relationship to your grazing operation. I've found over time managing different types of livestock that we don't want to plant our tree rows too closely together, because we create awkward grazing scenarios where you're kind of bottlenecking your animals into situations where they don't really want to graze. Generally speaking, somewhere between 30 to 50 feet for sheep and goats and kind of smaller animals, and 80 to 100 feet for cows is like a good starting point. It's not certainly a solid in concrete rule, but it's a good place to start. I've seen those systems operating on the land and working well. Now, it doesn't mean that in this example, we have about 40 or 50 feet between this row of willow, this willow hedge on the bottom here, and then the black locust at the top. And this is about as narrow as we go for the sheep. This might be even closer to like 40 feet. Doesn't mean I can't ever plant trees in here, but what I need to do is get the height of these trees, the locust and the willow in this case, tall enough so that the sheep can browse with them, and then I could just shift my fence line to kind of go down the middle of this paddock, right? And I could plant a new row of trees. And so we sometimes call that, successional planting, where we might start with a 50-foot spacing of our trees. Once those trees grow up, they can be put back into the grazing paddock, and then we could, insert a new row of trees. But just thinking about those kind of things as we go is really important. And placement, we have a disorder, I think, in the agroforestry and the forestry community, where we sometimes call it the winter catalog disorder, which is where the catalogs come in the winter. We think about all these wonderful trees that we want to plant in the landscape. We order hundreds and hundreds of dollars worth of trees, and then they show up in the spring. We have no idea where we're going to place them, right? And then we kind of just randomly stick them out in the landscape. It's really important that we understand individual species needs and where to put them in order for them to thrive. And so rather than buy 10 different types of species, if you're just getting to know trees, I would recommend starting with like 2 or 3 species and really get to know where they want to be, what they want to what conditions they need to thrive, and kind of starting there as you go. A couple questions here before we move on. Benefits of honey locust. I'm going to take a note of that because we're going to get to our little tree matrix, and we can visit honey locust as an example. That'll probably be more appropriate then. A question about tree clusters in single rows, or do we plant them in pairs? So in this case, we have here single row spacing, single rows of trees. We have planted in double and triple rows as well. Generally speaking, the research shows it's not recommended to plant more than a triple row of trees, because you start to have the interior trees really suffer from lack of access to light. But most of the cases on our farm, we're usually doing single rows of trees. The only exception to that is areas that we're thinking about as windbreaks that we want to do a denser planting. And James is asking about propagating trees like willow or poplar, or both in the same broader family. Yeah, it's really great to do cuttings of them, generally speaking, in the late winter prior to them breaking dormancy. So I would say actually like February or March is a good time. And you can basically take a cutting of those and root them very easily. I wish all trees grew as easily as poplar and willow, because you can just, generally speaking, take a cutting that's the diameters between like the thickness of your thumb and the thickness of your pinky. And then generally the cutting is around 12, as much as 18 inches long. So a foot to a foot and a half. Kind of depends on how much soil you're going to pound that into. And then you actually can pound it right into loose soil, or you can propagate it in beds or pots for the season and then transfer that out into the field. All right, I'm going to keep rolling here. Okay, so site prep would be our next area to really focus on. And what's key with site prep to understand is that we are introducing trees, in most cases in silvopasture, into environments that are not dominated by woody vegetation or a forest type ecosystem. And what's important to understand there is those soils are bacteria dominated. They're also dominated by generally grasses and forbs, and these types of plants form dense mats of roots that can hinder the development of young tree roots. Now, trees can persist and develop and coexist quite well with our pasture grasses. It's just in that initial 1, 2, and 3 seasons, usually, where the tree needs to get established before it can compete. So if we put a tiny little tree in to a well-formed area of sod, it's not going to do very well. I don't really recommend, if you're going to buy trees, that you buy them, sometimes you can buy them like 4 to 6 inches tall, like really small, just barely getting going. I would start with 12 to 18, 24-inch tall trees, because that usually means they've been growing for a season or more, and they're going to have more developed root systems, and they're going to be able to be put out in this environment. But regardless, we need to do something to kind of, in the short term at least, kind of beat back the grass and give the trees a bit of a leg up. And then we need to protect that and give the trees a chance to establish themselves before we allow the sod to kind of fill back in. So a couple examples here. On the left is what we are more and more interested in, which is this idea of tarping. My colleague at Cornell actually does a lot of research with tarping as a way to reduce tillage in annual vegetable systems. That's what we're showing here. But we started on our farm to use, these are silage tarps that you can get from farm supply stores, and sometimes from farmers who might have scraps around, depending on what you're trying to do. We don't need them this wide. We can go with much thinner strips on our tree planting, and you lay them down for generally 6 months during the growing season, or maybe as long as a year. So it's about getting a bit ahead of your planning and siting to get this down. But then the advantage here is you can really beat back stuff and create a really nice fertile space to plant your trees without any sort of machine or compaction impact or things like that. It just takes time and planning. So I think tarping has a good potential. It's something we're experimenting with more and more on the farm. We've done a lot in the past with tractors, with heavier machinery. I like the BCS and kind of the walk-behind tractors for a lot of tree establishment. So this is a planting we did at the student farm at Cornell. This is the rotary plow attachment on the BCS, which creates a nice fluffy bed to plant trees into. In this case, we're also doubling it up as a small swale, since this is such a steep slope. So we're kind of creating a bit of a berm to plant the trees into as we go. But we need to do something to disturb that sod layer and to create space for those trees to do well. All right. So that's probably more familiar. If you've planted trees before, you might be aware. And it can be as simple as, if you're planting a tree in a hole, you're digging the sod out and just flipping it upside down, right? That's fine too on a small scale. But often as we think about planting dozens or hundreds of trees, we want to do something that's applicable on a wider scale, which is often with our silvopasture plantings, we're thinking in dozens or maybe hundreds of trees. We're doing a planting of a community all at once as we go. So the thing I think that most people, and I would include this with a lot of folks who do conservation planting and a lot of work with trees, is they miss that fact that trees do not exist without fungal partners. They never have and they never will. And if we're especially planting them in open field situations, we need to bring that fungal presence into that space, because it's not likely to be very strong there. Once we bring it in, it can hang on, it can survive, and it can take care of itself, and it will continue to grow and as the trees grow. But we do need to introduce it in the beginning. So there's a couple different ways to do this. Some people I know harvest a bit of soil from a healthy woodland on their farm and simply add that into the top dressing that they might do, and that can certainly potentially increase fungal partners. That certainly can work. Compost can sometimes do that, and also wood chips as a mulch. We'll talk about mulch in a bit. Will probably bring some fungal presence, although the majority of fungus that come on wood chips are often decomposers, and what we're talking about with fungal partners are the mycorrhizal fungi. And we talked about this last week. Myco means mushroom or fungus, and rhizal means root. So these are specifically the fungus that form beneficial connective relationships with trees. And I showed this image, I'll just go up to it quickly because it's so cool, of this white pine seedling with its mycorrhizal fungal network here. And so you can see the darker, thicker roots of the white pine here, and then all the fungus mycelium, which expands this tree's root system, 50, 60, 75%, and harvests a lot of the water and nutrients and exchanges that with the tree for sugars and carbohydrates. And so again, very important to tree health. And it's been shown through a lot of trials that adding fungal inoculants into your planting scheme really helps, especially in young trees getting established and thriving. So a couple possibilities. This is just one example of a mycorrhizal, what's called a root dip. There's a lot of different products on the market. This is one we've used before. We've used a bunch of other ones. We haven't personally done a side-by-side trial with them, but check them out. It's basically a bunch of different species. In this case, I think it's like hundreds of thousands of species. And the whole idea is you're kind of throwing a bunch of things at the fridge and seeing what sticks. So it's not all of them will necessarily survive, but some of them will. And there's a lot of generalist mycorrhizal fungi that could potentially match up with the different trees you're planting. What's key to understand with this is, in most cases, this is not the fungi that produce fruiting mushrooms. Most mycorrhizal fungi actually don't produce fruiting mushrooms. So we're familiar maybe with some of the really gourmet mushrooms like boletes and chanterelles and morels and things like that. Those are mycorrhizal species, but that's not what we're inoculating here. We're inoculating a whole host of other organisms where we may never see a fruiting body, but they're still doing that really important work underneath the soil. Okay, so that's one option. Basically, it's a powder. You mix it in with the water, and then you soak your trees or dip your trees in it before you're putting them in the ground. So when we go out to the field, we'll set up our root dip. We'll actually leave it overnight, usually when it's warmer, and allow the fungi to sort of wake up because they're dormant when they're in the powder form. And some people will add compost tea. Some people will aerate it. There's all sorts of ways to potentially stimulate the fungal activity. And then you just leave your trees in there as you're planting them. And you get a nice kind of, if you do the right proportions, it's almost like a gel that globs onto the roots. And then you plant the tree down into the soil. If you want to go a little bit deeper, this is something we're starting to play with and really having fun within the whole kind of discipline of Korean natural farming, which is very interesting on a lot of levels, is this idea of harvesting microorganisms, including fungi, but also other bacteria, other microbes that exist in the soil. And one of the theories behind this is that it's not just fungi that are important, and also that the best fungi you're going to find for your trees already grow in your climate. They're already adapted to your climate conditions, your soil conditions, and so we should be using those as the foundation of our fungal and microbe development in our soil. And so it's very simple techniques. I did a tiny URL. So if you go to tinyurl.com/harvesting IMOs, and IMOs stands for indigenous microorganisms. You can actually read a quick article that shows some different methods for harvesting them. And it kind of comes down to like you sterilize rice and you put it in the woods upside down and you give it some time and you give it some exposure to the soil. And the idea is that the microorganisms sort of jump onto that, and then you can harvest them and you can brew, again, kind of a root dip or some other kind of inoculum from that. So it's kind of interesting stuff and something we're really playing with and really want to keep thinking about. But one way or the other, you should be introducing fungal partners into the system. I think we're going to see that really help our trees thrive. Okay. So you've probably heard the saying, 10-cent tree, $100 hole. It's really important that we plant our trees properly. And this is something that, again, often in classes, I'll go over in detail. And I'll ask everyone, who knows how to plant a tree? And almost everyone raises their hand. And then by the end of it, when I go through this in great detail, they realize, oh, I don't actually know how to plant a tree. There's so many little details to it. It becomes very habitual. I don't want to oversell it as something that's really hard to do, but paying attention to the details and then figuring out a process that works to ensure the trees are planted right is really important. Probably the biggest thing I'd recommend is having always 2 people in the tree planting process. So one of the things we do is whoever's shown up on the farm or we've hired for the day or whatever to plant trees, first thing we do is we go prepare the site. If that means digging holes, we go dig all the holes. We do that first. And then we go back through with the trees, and one person is in charge of the tree and the other person is in charge of the hole. So we have this open hole, and the first thing we should know is that the hole should be, in general, at least 1.5 times the diameter of the root spread, and or excuse me, I gotta say diameter, the depth of the root spread. So how deep the deepest root grows, the hole should be 1.5 times deeper than that, and then 2 times the width of your root, because our trees, no matter what, even if they're taprooted trees, they need to grow out horizontally in order to get themselves established. So often folks dig a hole much smaller and doesn't give the roots a lot of space to grow. We want to create a really nice, fluffy, loose soil for them to grow in, but not too fluffy. It's fluffy enough to sort of extract and then put back in the soil. Okay, so a couple things here. What I like to do is extract that from the hole, put that soil aside. I take the sod and put that off to the side. Any nice soil that I can add back into the hole, I'll put in a nice pile, because I'm going to use that again. Often in the tractor or the truck, we'll have extra topsoil somewhere else on the farm that we can add to the hole. We don't want to actually add compost or amendments into the hole. Generally speaking, you want to put them on top. If you add them into the hole, you can bind up some of the carbon, some of the nitrogen in the hole potentially, and cause problems. So we try to put those on top always. What we want to put in the hole is topsoil, okay? And we create this kind of mound you can see there in the image. We spread out the roots, so the person in charge of the tree is making sure those roots can have a nice spread over that mound. Again, this might be a time to pull out those pruners, and you notice a few more roots that might be problematic, thinking about that we want this tree to grow out and down. So we create that, and then we backfill around it while the person's holding the tree, making sure that the base of the tree, which is, there's usually a flare or some kind of indication where the tippy top of the surface roots come out. Usually there's a flare. You want to plant at the base of the flare in the tree, right at ground level. So we backfill in the tree, and then we actually step on it quite a bit. We want to, without like jumping on it or using a compactor or anything, within our kind of own weight and our own impact, just to stomp all the soil back down. We don't want to create air pockets in there, because the tree can actually have too much oxygen and it won't allow the roots to survive. They'll actually die off of that. So we stomp it back down, and then we're good to go after we add our mulch, right? So that takes a long time to explain. Once you get used to it, you can do, you can be planting trees in less than a minute with 2 people kind of going down the trench or down the line with the holes or something like that as we go. Just seeing if there's any questions on here. I see a question back to the fungal communities. Jennifer's mentioning that, given all the land in New York State that was forested originally, wouldn't the fungal communities still be here, even if diminished? So great question. And yes, to some degree, although the level of diminishment is pretty drastic. And it kind of depends on how recently these areas were in forest. What researchers know is that as forests come back, so do fungal communities, but never at the capacity or the diversity or the sort of success, or what do I want to say, the complexity of original systems. Just because land is covered in trees, it's not the same as covered in an old growth forest. And so yes, there's some there, and I think that's why the sort of proposal to harvest fungal partners from the landscape is really compelling, but it might be harder to pull that out. And so some cases we might want to bring more of that to the landscape. But absolutely they're there, but certainly in severely diminished quality, diminished health, and that sort of thing. Suzanne's asking if our soil is 70% aggregate, what should we do to plant? Do we have to remove all the rock? It sounds like if you removed all the rock, you wouldn't have a lot of anything left. So in soils that have that much aggregate, we focus on trees that perform well in those soils. There's plenty of species that do that. Generally speaking, you want trees that are either taprooted or that form really intense fibrous root systems. So a couple examples of those: taprooted trees. I think of the nut trees really thriving well in those. And then things like poplar and willow and hazelnut, for instance, have very dense fibrous root systems in that case. So just a couple examples there. We could go off on that tangent all day here. Another question, do we ever water before backfilling our trees, or do you wait to water? So the tree again is sitting in the bucket of the fungal material, so it's already getting a good amount of water, because they're going to sit in there probably half hour to even a couple hours if we're planting out a bunch. So I don't tend to water in the hole. I'll fill it back in, and then I'll come back through and water things in if needed. If the climate and weather of late is sufficient in terms of rainfall, then I don't tend to water trees in. And a big thing I hear about planting and about doing all these things is reducing or even eliminating the need to do supplemental watering. Because if you're talking about, we've planted 300 or 500-foot rows of trees, I'm not going to go and water each of those by hand, right? And it's also not economical in a lot of places on our farm to think about piping water over there and doing irrigation. So if we have dense root systems, if we site our trees well, if we bring in fungal companions, if we plant our trees properly, almost in all cases, we can get away with not watering them supplementally. And I found, it's been true this year. We had a tree planting that happened this year. It was abnormally dry/drought here in central New York. A tree planting we did of a couple hundred trees that we still saw about 80% of them surviving. So ideally, you plant a tree on a wet year where there's plenty of moisture. Doesn't mean you don't want to have a plan or, when possible, water those trees. But I think if all these other factors are in place, you can severely reduce or potentially even eliminate that need, which I think alleviates some of our fear around planting trees if we have to water each one individually. So, and edit that for your climate too, as well, right? But also, in our temperate climate, I should say, not planting in the hottest part of the year really helps reduce that as well. So getting them in either in the early spring or in that late fall really also reduces the need for those initial trees to get going. Trees have been getting themselves going and thriving in landscapes for a long time. And I don't think supplemental water is always the thing, even though it's something people often focus on. I think all these other pieces are much more important. Okay, so after we have our tree wonderfully planted in the hole, we've gotten our planting done, then we really have to obviously protect it from browse. And so the question here is, what's going to be feasible, economical? What are the different pressures that we're dealing with on our site as we work through this? So a couple considerations. It is always cheaper to fence groups of trees versus individual trees in terms of a per tree cost. It's going to be cheaper to fence out an area or a row than it is to fence each individual tree. So it's another good reason to plant densely and to fence, a community rather than some individuals. So this system here is very nice. It's very comprehensive. We have welded wire fencing with a stake. We have vegetation mat here to keep out competitive vegetation. We have a root guard to prevent girdling rodents and things like that. This is close to $10 per tree in terms of cost, right? And that was on a farm in Virginia. And then up the road, no, this is actually New York, this example here. This is what we call a three-dimensional fence, a 3D fence, mainly for keeping out livestock and deer. This fence in this example is not electrified. You can see the rope or tape is wrapped around T-posts. So if you electrify that, it would ground out. But the point of this photo more is the structure. So we have an outer fence where we have a line of tape about a foot off the ground, and then one close to 4 feet off the ground, and then about a meter or 3 feet from that interior, we have one line that's splitting the difference. And you could use this with high tensile wiring. You could do this with rope or tape. If it's insulated, you would want to electrify it. And this farmer's example is a good teller of it. They don't tend to work very well if they're not electrified. But if they're electrified, and sometimes you have to bait them, you train the deer, if that's your main concern, on them, and then they'll leave your trees alone. And the whole idea is that with two fences like this, you're inhibiting the deer's propensity to jump, and because they don't feel like they can make that span. And if it's electrified, then they tend to stay away. Doesn't always work, not necessarily 100%. I've been to plenty of farms where this does work with high deer density, with low deer density, with medium density. This is the cheapest way to fence a large area of trees economically. There's other systems out there. One of the things I'm working on is figuring out how to categorize and look at the different costs of those systems in our future kind of Silvopasture content. But I contrast these two as one of the most expensive ways to protect a tree and one of the cheapest ways. If I was buying really fancy cultivars of a nut variety or apple tree or something like that, I would probably go with the fencing on the left, right? I want to protect my $50 tree with a $10 fence. But if I'm doing a field of seedlings, I'm mixing different native trees and black locust and willow and things, I'd want to go with more of a group fencing. For us, our net fencing that we use for the sheep, in many cases also we're able to just use that to fence the sheep off the trees when they're in the area, and then we just leave the trees be, because especially on kind of the home range, we don't have to worry as much about deer. They don't pass through there. Now, as we plant further and further out, we're finding we have to increase our protection from wild herbivores browse on the trees. Okay, and then finally here, I think. Oh no, we got two more here. Mulch, very important. Something to, as the inevitably you've done that sod disturbance, but you gotta keep it up enough to get that tree established. You can see here, in this case we harvested straw from our mobile duck house, so it's nice little phosphorus inoculated straw with their poo. We use that as mulch. We could just wheel the duck house right over here, drop it off, and then put fresh bedding in. This is not weed proof. You can see the stuff growing up through there, but it's enough to get these trees up and established and healthy before the sod sort of takes over. And that's really all mulch is supposed to do. It is not like your backyard landscape where you might want to never see a weed pop up. That's not the goal here. The goal is to give the trees a leg up as they go. And so whatever is the cheapest and easiest for you to lay out and to potentially re-up, often mulch has to be reapplied to make sure you're giving your trees a chance, that's what you should do. So this was easy for us in this case. We are fond of the free wood chip pile in town, and on my way home from work, I'll often fill up the truck, and then on my way, when I get home, I'll drive along a tree row and just throw some mulch down on the trees. I've seen folks get old round bales, roll those out, plant right in those, or use those as mulch or something like that. I've seen people use flail mowers and actually just cut a bunch of material and then layer it on, or even save their grass clippings and layer that on as a mulch. Like, think creatively, look around you, see what kind of materials you can easily get your hands on and easily do. A farmer I visited had a friend who was a coffee roaster and had ample amounts of burlap bags, and so that's what he was using to mulch, right? So think creatively about it. Know that you need to keep applying it, especially in year 1 and 2, to keep that mulch layer going so that those trees can get established and get healthy. And then the grass can grow right back in. It's not a problem after that initial time. All right, and then finally, you got to have a maintenance plan, because I think, again, as I alluded to in the beginning, we often say, I planted these trees and I'm done. And we need to think about the first 1 to 3 years of the tree's life and what kind of needs it might have. So some trees might need some light pruning or heavy pruning, depending. Think carefully about the types of trees you're planting. Obviously, fruit trees, nut trees are going to need a lot more intensive care versus something that might be just going through, like with our black locust, we often are doing some just really quick pruning to avoid a lot of split crotches where the tree's kind of growing away from itself and can create problems in our high wind environment. We've talked about water. Maybe I need water. I should at least have a plan so that if I feel like it's a serious drought, that I can still take care of my trees. And we always think on the farm of having 1 or 2 or maybe 3 ways to water something, to bring water to the animals, to bring water to our trees. We have above ground line, we have below ground line, we have pumps, and we always think of some manual way that we can move water. So here's our old farm truck. That's the plow truck that doesn't ever leave the farm because it wouldn't last on the highway. But we can always move a tank of water somewhere if we need it on the landscape, except in the wettest parts of the property. We may need to thin our trees eventually, and that could come in the first 5 years. It could come in the first 10 years. We're actually thinning out, and hopefully that's a harvest event where you're actually valuing what you're getting off of those trees. And then we might need to be monitoring for disease, depending on the species, again, as we go. So that's kind of the basics. And again, it can feel like a mouthful, but there's a lot of pieces here that I think taken together will really increase the chances of success for different trees in our landscape, and will become second nature, like many things may have become for you if you're more familiar with them and you've done them again and again. A question I want to leave you with is to think about, how many trees do I feel like I could plant in a year? How many trees do I feel like I can maintain in a year? And that total number is is indicative. If I say that I can maintain 100 trees a year, including planting, well, then I should only plant like 30 trees a year, because I'm going to need to plant 30 the first year. I'm going to plant 30 the second year, but I'm going to have to take care of those first 30. And the third year, I'm going to have to plant 30 more, take care of the 30 from the year before, and take care of the 30 from the year before that, right? There's my 100 trees in 3 years that I'm taking care of, right? So think about that. Do realistic. It doesn't matter if you plant 1,000 trees a year, 100 trees a year, or 10 trees a year, but just start planting trees and thinking about and trying things out that then you could imagine scaling up. But don't bite off more than you can chew, because you'll end up with a lot of dead trees, and then you'll be sad. And you probably won't, plant them again. All right, so just a couple more things, a couple more tools, because I'm not going to have time to do everything. That's impossible. I wanted to show this. This is something I've been working on with our recent Silvopasture online class. I want to emphasize something with trees that I think is really important. We talked about the position in the landscape, and so what we've actually developed here is what we're seeing is, generally speaking, we can say the upland species show up on this corner of the chart, and lowland species are showing up on this bottom left corner, where we have generally drier, warmer microclimates and more well-drained soils in upper parts of the landscape, and generally cooler and moister and more poorly drained environments on the lowland part of the site, right? So we have an x-axis or a horizontal axis of microclimate. We have trees that like dry, warm environments over to trees that like cool and moist environments. And then with soil, we have well-drained to poorly drained soil. So we started arranging and talking about different species and how they fit in. This is a handout that's available on our website. I will put it on the resources page right now. It's on the events page near the announcement for these webinars, but it will live long-term on the resources page. But if you want to think about this, if you don't see your species here, the question is, where does it fit? And there's a big difference between preference versus tolerance. So while black locust I have over here, it likes slightly warmer microclimates, and every tree, what I should say is every tree likes well-drained soil that's slightly moist. Like every tree, you read about it, and it kind of like shows up right up in this quadrant here. But we're thinking also about tolerance and preference. So black locust, actually, we could say starting here will grow all the way up into these more well-drained soils, and to some degree it will grow in cooler and moister soils. But at some point it gets too wet for it, and they don't do well, and it can also get too dry or too warm for it. So I leave this concept just to think about the relationship and the intersection between soil and microclimate as two really important factors that help you think about where you're going to place your trees on the landscape. Another tool that we have on the website that I'll just mention, we're just kind of getting going here, it's on the resources page, is a tree calculator. One question I get a lot is, how many trees am I talking about here? If I'm going to plant X amount of trees on this space, at this spacing, and that sort of thing. So we developed a calculator. A friend of mine who's really great with spreadsheets. Hopefully someday this calculator also help us think about things like carbon sequestration, like how much carbon are we going to sequester if we do this type of planting. But for now, we have a basic calculator that also gets at some of the costs of establishing trees. So I'll share this for a couple minutes. I'll take any last questions, and that'll probably be about all the time we have together for this session here. If we take an acre here, if you have less than an acre, you can convert it to square meters or feet. I mentioned that in many of our plantings, we go 3 to 4 feet between trees, and then we might do 60 feet between our rows, right? And then there's an option here to do single, double, or triple tree spacing, and you get a number of trees. And there's a slight modification here. We have a rough square kind of acre versus what we call rectangle A or B. And if you look at these little carrots, rectangle A is where you have a long rectangle where the trees you're going to plant is essentially more or less parallel to that long side, and rectangle B would be where those trees are more or less perpendicular to the long side. Okay, And eventually we'll have some pictures here to help you visualize that. But the idea is that depending on the spacing between trees and between rows, you're going to have different values here. In this case, there's not a huge difference in the number of trees, but in other scenarios, there definitely is quite a bit of difference. After you get that information, you choose your shape that you're generally thinking about, and then you can get a cost per tree. Now we have on the left side of all these something that this is what we've calculated. If you wanted to override it, you can always put a number in here. Let's say, oh, I'm only going to actually plant 150 trees. We have recommended cost per tree, but you might know more actual costs. So I might say, well, actually, I'm growing my own trees and it only costs me 50 cents or something like that. And it'll override that. And so what it's doing is just calculating what your cost per tree might be for this specific type of planting. And we do the same thing with labor. We assume a certain number of minutes per tree, and then it gives you a labor cost. And you can override those by putting things in custom. All right. So I mention this because I want to encourage folks to think about a specific area on their land, and using kind of a general shape. It may not be a perfect rectangle or square, but it gets very complicated with the math if we try to accommodate every shape. But look at what it would actually cost. And you may not actually pay for the labor, but it's important to know what your labor costs and things like that. So that's another tool that I encourage you to play with. Give us feedback on it if it's working for you or not. And we're just excited. The different folks I've been working with, we're thinking about ways that we can have more success, have more silvopasture on farms, and I think some of these things are going to hopefully help you all and help us along the way as well. So I'll leave it there. I see a question, and I'll repeat again. Jerry is saying, okay, my presentation's about how to plant trees so they'll thrive. This is great, but why do trees die in silvopasture, and how can you save them? So I'll reiterate that the way that the reason trees die in silvopasture is a lack of all these things. I just was trying to flip it on its head. My old presentation sort of talked about all the silly errors that we've made that lead trees to die. So the top ones here would be the stock we select not having healthy, positive root systems when they go in the ground. We don't place them in the right places, and we don't do the site prep. We don't add the fungal partners. All these kind of pieces are why trees die. And when I go onto a site and someone says, yeah, I planted these 50 trees and only 10 of them survived, well, we can usually dig in and figure out one, most times 2 or 3 of these things, and that leads us to understand why they didn't thrive. So that's really the same answer, I would argue, at the end of the day. Suzanne's asking about black locust propagation or growing. So they grow wild nearby. If they grow wild nearby, black locust is best propagated actually from seed, and usually November and December is the best time of year to collect seed for those. You want to make sure that the the seeds have fully dried out. Actually, this fall for us has been particularly wet, and so I'm going to wait much later to harvest seed. Once you harvest them, they're very easy to store. They have a very hard seed coat, and before you plant them, you actually need to scarify them by putting them in boiling water, essentially. Or you boil water, turn it off, and put the seeds in there overnight, and then you put them in your soil the next day. It's really not successful to take cuttings from them. That Trees of Power book I recommended is a great source for getting to know some trees. All trees could potentially be propagated from many different ways, but it seems like every species has its top preferred way. So we could think about, from seed, from hardwood cuttings, which is cutting during their dormancy, softwood cuttings, which is cutting when they're actively growing. We could do cuttings from the roots, or transplanting, or division, which division isn't usually that common for a lot of tree species, but sometimes you can take a root flare and cut some of the roots and propagate from there. So every tree species will have its own preferred way. And so root cuttings, you can sometimes get them from black locust, but seed is really the most reliable way to do that kind of work.
So Steve, I know we're just about out of time. I know there's some folks that are wondering about the calculator, and is that available to the public right now? It's on
So if you go to our website, and click on resources. It's right down here. And you'll click on this link, and it should ask you to make a copy. I'm going to make sure. I see someone said the permissions weren't right. What it should do is create a copy, because you can't use the original spreadsheet or else you'll overwrite all the things. So you're making your own copy, which you can save to either save the Google Sheet if you have that, or you can download it as an Excel file once you get in there. So let me, I'm seeing some folks, I just kind of put it on there as a link, so I may need to change the permissions, but you'll be able to do that just pretty soon after the webinar is over if you're having trouble.
Awesome. And will you give a little plug for what you'll be talking about next week in our third session, so folks know what's coming up?
Yeah, and then I'm happy to stay on for a few more. There's some great questions
Okay.
here about
Okay.
different trees. So next week we're gonna, that talk is called Right Animal, Right Place, Right Time. So we're gonna talk specifically about different types of animals. We think about the small ruminants, we think about cows and larger ruminants, the poultry, the pigs, and we're going to think about those groups in relationship to silvopasture in particular, and ways they can plug in and ways they might cause some trouble. So that'll be our focus next week.
Awesome. And it looks like that would probably answer a couple of the questions that came up on the chat, or at least get started with that.
Yeah, well, let's see. So let's see. Let me find where it ended here. I'll start with some of the seed questions. David has a great question about impact of animals on the landscape, and then Jerry's also asking about rotational grazing and questions around livestock in the woods and compaction. I think those two I'm really going to get into next week and share some information about that. The short answer I'd say on those bigger questions is that's why we say right animal, right place, and right time, because if it's very easy to impact any landscape with any size animal at the wrong time and have a negative impact. And so what we need to think creatively about is when it's appropriate, when it may not be appropriate for a certain animal in a certain place. So it is a big topic, and we'll dig into that in our next conversation next week. Joanne, ash cannot be started from cuttings. Best started from seed is the short answer. Honey locust seeds, and I was going to revisit honey locust. Honey locust is an interesting one. It's one we planted on our farm and we're hoping was going to do well. The pods are actually edible by livestock and can be a good supplemental winter feed. The thorns are a bit problematic, so that's a negative on the honey locust. But what we found is that our soil is just too darn clayey, and our site is too moist, and we don't have a warm enough microclimate for the honey locust to thrive. One of the things I talked about last week that I'll recommend is, if you're not sure which species are going to thrive on your site, then consider doing what I sometimes call like a test planting. So, buy 10 of those 10 different species you're interested in, plant them all out on the site, and see who does well after a few years, if you have that time. Well, after 4 years, our black locust was 25 or 30 feet tall, and the honey locust was still only 1 or 2 feet tall. And we had done the same kind of soil treatment, we had the same kind of fungal root dip, all that kind of stuff I talked about. So that was just not a good site for the honey locust. And then I go down to Virginia, or I go down to parts of Pennsylvania, not too far from us on the border, and I see these sites that have really warm microclimates, much better drainage in their soils, and honey locusts are just thriving, right? And we see honey locusts loving urban environments, which are often very porous soils and warm microclimates. So pay attention to where these species are growing and where you see them really doing well, because that'll give you a lot of information for your own site. And try a test planting maybe before you plant, or commit to hundreds or thousands of trees of any kind of type. And I think that's it for now.
Yeah, I think that's great. Excellent. Well, that's wonderful. It looks like it's like a great lead into next week's session. In fact, let me just do a little bit of housekeeping before we sign off for today. There is going to be a very, very short survey that pops up on your screen after this webinar closes. So if you're able to take a minute to give us some feedback, we'd appreciate it so much. And let's see, I will be sending out a follow-up email in the morning with a link to the recording and a link to Steve's website and the past couple of webinars that we've done with Steve as well. So keep an eye out for that. Quick plug for some upcoming webinars. Steve mentioned we will be back same place, same time next week for part 3, which should be really wonderful. And then in December, we're going to be holding a info session about our Humane Farming Mentorship Program if folks are interested in serving as mentors or mentees. And then we're just getting our new lineup for the winter months as well. And yeah, lots of other stuff going on. I'll send out links to our Fund a Farmer grant application and other services and resources that we are offering currently. So I think that's about it. I really want to thank you, Steve, for sticking around, answering all these wonderful questions. Really appreciate you taking the time to tailor this to everyone's needs. Give a really great, excellent presentation, and thanks to everyone out there in the audience. It's wonderful to have you. Thanks for your questions and your interest, and everyone making some progress. So I hope that we're all able to connect again soon, and that you have a wonderful evening, and we'll talk to you again on another webinar. Bye, everyone.